The other major format that you might see is a thing called coverage. And coverages is the legacy format, an older format. Let me just pull this back down and look for a coverage. If we go to our data formats, contents, this one called New York Geo is our coverage. And the ArcGIS gives it this little icon that looks like multiple sheets laying on top of each other. And if we look at it in the contents within there, we have a number of what they're now calling feature classes. And they are the ones we see here are arc, label, polygon, region, poly, and then tick. And some of these are system type of files like tick. That's the equivalent of what we might call a projection file now. It identifies where in the world this data set resides using something they used to call tick marks. Coverage also has a polygon feature class here. So if I expand it here and then select poly, I can preview it. And it looks very similar to what, a polygon structure, just like a shapefile. And so we have our data in polygons, and we can preview it, just like it, and it has a table and things associated with it. So it's very, very similar in structure to what you see with a shapefile or what you see with a geodatabase feature class. And the coverage also has a thing called arc. Let me preview these. And they look just like the polygons, but actually these are arcs. And this is where ArcInfo got its name, is the fact that things used to be stored as individual arcs, and then the system would combine these arcs and create polygons and make a number of tables so that they know exactly which polygon was related to which polygon was adjacent to another polygon. Of course, it had to keep track of all the arcs that made up any one polygon, and so forth. So that's where the idea of arc came from for the ArcInfo structure. In a short time, I'll show you where the info came from. So this is what coverage looks like in ArcGIS and ArcCatalog. It looks, to the eye, it's pretty straightforward. If I just collapse that and just pick this and said preview, I would get essentially the polygon preview. If it was points, I get the point preview or the line, that type of thing. So within your own system, it works fine. No one's needs to be concerned with it. However, when you go to the hard drive, what does it look like when it's written out to the hard drive, and what sort of folders and files are related to it? This is where the info comes from that we all think of as ArcInfo, is from this folder right here. Now let me pull up this folder, and what we were looking at was the geo. This folder are related to each other. That relationship, if it's broken, will corrupt the data again. Let me just pull up a little information on the coverage. This will show you a little bit about the coverage data set, and you can go through and just type in coverage and data set, and you'll find this. This is the structure for the coverage data set, and it has essentially a what we would call a coverage layer or coverage folder, and inside there are those little feature classes that we looked at. But there's also always associated with it something called info, and that info directory is what contains the database information that relates to the geometry. And that relationship is maintained through system files within the info directory and what they call the coverage directory. That's how it's able to work with these ticks and nodes and label points and arcs and rebuild all of these polygons so that the system can actually do manipulations. The workspace and how this is laid out for a coverage is like this. We have this thing called a workspace, simply any directory at all. What defines a workspace for ArcInfo is this thing called info. A workspace that contains a number of coverages is only going to have one info directory, and it has a number of these very strange looking files in it. And then every what they would call coverage directory or folder would have its coverage name and also some interesting files, but they're a little bit more recognizable. That's a tick file, a boundary file, the arc file is storing the arcs, label files, things like that. And there's a relationship back and forth between files in here, in the, say, the soils coverage folder, and the files in the info folder. And this is what gave the power to ArcInfo, was that relationship back and forth. But it also created problems. So let me go back to our look on the hard drive. So if we open this up, open up the info folder, there are those info files. We don't really know which ones relate to New York Geo. And you might say, well, they all do. Well, they don't. There's another, it's not a coverage file, it's actually a grid file, and we'll talk about that next. Right here, called New York Land Cog._clip. And I expand that out, and you see the files within that folder are a little different. It's because it is a grid format. But the thing is that that grid format also relates to these info files. Somewhere in here, there's info files that relate to that grid format. And somewhere in here are info files that relate to the geo format. Not easy and intuitive how to, which ones are which are needed, and you can't just try and select them out of info and to go up with the coverage. In essence, you have to export it, or used to have to export it. Within the catalog, we can copy that and paste it in another folder, and it will keep everything together. It will create a new info directory if it's not existing, and it will put all the data in. It keeps that and moves it around. But this can become a nightmare for people who aren't familiar with this structure, because they'll see New York Geo and they'll think everything in there is all they need. And this has happened many times, especially with students first learning the system, and they'll just copy that folder and they'll give it to somebody else saying, there's my data, and the person opening it up will not see anything. They won't be able to get to the data at all, because it needs files in this info directory, in this info folder. So that breaking that relationship corrupts the data. And the really worst possible instance is when someone sees the info folder and has no idea what it is and decides that it might be a bad thing and throws it all away. And that truly is a bad thing. So that's the format for the coverage. It's kind of interesting. It has a lot of linkages back and forth. It gave it a lot of power. And it actually is the same format used for what is called the grid, or a raster, which is a specific raster data format. And the grid format follows the same structure as the coverage format. Let me look up the grid format here. The difference with grids, of course, is that it's a raster data set. It's storing information based on a square cell superimposed on the real world, and a single value goes into that cell. And that storage is mainly used for surfaces and things like that. But it, as far as ArcGIS is concerned, you see it just like you do any other data sets. If I flick back to my catalog, this is a raster data set, the one I mentioned earlier. If I click on it, that's what it looks like. It's a land cover data set from GAP for New York State. And if I zoom into it, then it'll become obvious that it's raster data. You'll start to see the raster grid cell outlines as it steps down and things like that, based on, I believe this is a 30-meter cell structure. So that's the grid cell, or the raster data set, a raster data set. Let me go back to here. And that, of course, just like the coverages, has a table attached to it, and it has data sets attached, data attached to that table. It's a little different in that we don't have a specific shape file or shape identified, like polygon, whatever. We have rows, values, and counts. And value is our key code because it is raster data sets. Things are stored by number. And we can have essentially a lookup table associated with each one of those values. So we know that 1 is related to spruce fir, 22 is a mixed wetland, and so forth. But the system is always going to use these value codes here and to maintain the operation. And if we use algebra, these are the ones it's going to be based on. And on the hard drive, it looks the same as the coverage. We have these files, somewhat better. This is a header file to understand. This is the statistics file. VAT is the attribute, like a histogram file. And then the ADF is an ArcData file, and you can see that that's a much larger piece. That's where the actual data information is stored. And then these are all maintained and linked up back with some sort of file in this info directory. So again, that has to go together, those two folders. So if you start moving and manipulating data around, you need to keep that in mind. And the easiest way to handle this type of data format, if you wanted to, say, give someone the New York land cover raster data set, is to perhaps copy it. And you can do that in Catalog very easy, just by copying it. Copy it and create a new folder, and then simply paste it in that folder and make a copy of that data set. Then that way, if I go out to the hard drive and show you the data set, data info, and we should have a new folder. Here it is. And you notice I have an info folder, and I have the land clip folder, and a few other XML folders. And now I know that if I was to zip all of this new folder, I would get the full raster data set, the full grid format data set. So it's important to keep in mind how these things are stored on your hard drive, so you know how you can package them up and share them with other people. Now, the raster data set, of course, doesn't just refer to the grid format. There's also things like JPEGs are considered rasters. And so that comes into the system. It's obviously a JPG is just a single file. That can be used in ArcGIS and manipulated around. And there are other raster formats that are also single files, like IMG and things like that. And this is another instance as to why they came up with this file geodatabase, is so we can put all these things in one. So we can have such things as tax parcels, and we can have roads, and we can have images.